Hello, Keeling Middle School World Culture students.
Hello.
This is Mr. Shove.
And Ms. Crouch.
And Mr. Jackson. And we are going to talk to you today about the beginning of modern times in Europe. Now, the Middle Ages ended, which you'll get more on in the future when we do an online activity about it, but the Middle Ages ended due to the breakup of feudalism and the growth of cities. The European modern times do overlap. We're going to talk about four main ideas. The first is the Renaissance. The second is the Reformation, Catholic Reformation, Age of Exploration, and Revolution. You may remember this timeline that you saw last time, and this just shows you where exactly we are going to be locating, where we're going to be talking about, and specifically starting about in the 14th century or the mid-1300s, specifically in Italy. And to start us talking about Renaissance, I'm going to throw it to Miss Crouch.
Hello. Well, as Mr. Schiff said, the Renaissance started in the mid-14th century, which as we know is the 1300s. It's really when a time in history when education, art, and science grew pretty rapidly in some places. Especially, it began in northern Italy, the cities of Florence and Venice, and spread throughout Europe. But at different places, it spread more quickly than others.
So in the Renaissance, why were they turning away from just the Catholic Church to answer all their questions?
That's a good question, Mr. Shove. Tell us about it.
Well, you're going to learn more about this in the future, but humanism, just kind of the belief in the individual and learning about what humans' purpose is on this world, people started to look more at actually the science, the math, the anatomy, to try to answer questions other than just explaining it with Catholic Christianity.
Kind of like I paid you to say that, Mr. Shove. We're going to be talking about art, music, science, and such during the Renaissance and how it was so different from the Middle Ages. And let's start with Renaissance art. So you've got a lot of different artists coming out during this time that are still very popular today, including Michelangelo, who painted the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is the chapel in Rome, or actually more specifically the Vatican City, which is the head of the Catholic Church. In this painting, you've got the figure of God reaching out towards the figure of man. And you can see how man is a lot more relaxed in this case, and it seems like God's doing the work to reach man, which is certainly a different statement than it would be before. So the next person we want to talk about, and it's in the blank in your notes, is Leonardo da Vinci. He was a very famous painter as well as inventor, which we'll talk about in a few moments. He painted the famous paintings, the Portrait of Mona Lisa, as you can see here, and The Last Supper, which is another famous painting depicting the Last Supper of Jesus of Nazareth before his execution. You've got other famous sculptors and painters at this time. Donatello. This is Lady Magdalena, I think.
I believe you're right.
And Michelangelo with David, a very famous statue.
Now, I only see half of the statue there, Miss Crouch.
Oh, I thought I'd keep it clean.
Ah.
They were into the human form in the Renaissance, so as you can see by these. Botticelli painted Venus of Milo? De Milo?
The Birth of Venus?
Birth of Venus.
Venus de Milo?
This is Venus de Milo figure, and Birth of Venus is the name of the painting. And then Rembrandt painted this painting of what's happening here. Mr. Shove, tell us what's happening here.
Well, for the first time, people began to learn more about anatomy. Now, it had always been very illegal to just take bodies and carve them up. It was against the church's teachings. So a lot of times, for the first time ever, people started to use cadavers. They started to actually pilfer sometimes cemeteries, or early medical schools would sprout up, and they would actually buy bodies and then use them in order to teach medicine. People didn't know what the insides really looked like that much. And so for the first time, this is going to be an advancement not just in art, but also obviously in science.
Fascinating, and also worth mentioning that, this is a non-religious painting. At the time, this was quite a development, that they were creating art that was not based around religion entirely. Right. Now we're continue talking about innovation and invention. We mentioned that Leonardo da Vinci was not just a painter, but a very, very famous inventor. He invented such things as the precursors to the modern helicopter, parachutes, flying machines. You can read the rest. You'll need to pick 3 and put them in your notes, but pretty amazing. that he came up with the ideas for those things before modern days.
Now, Ms. Krause, did he build these helicopters and these parachutes and these flying machines?
He didn't actually. He just sketched out the basic ideas for them, which were then many years later to become, the basis for modern machines.
What an amazing man.
So intelligent. Johann Gutenberg is the next guy who worth mentioning. He invented the modern printing press, which we'll talk about later, and which was used to create one of the most famous early books, the Gutenberg Bible. We'll talk much more about him later. Other interesting inventions of the time worth mentioning, I think. Eyeglasses and lenses. Before this time, if you had poor eyesight, you were basically disabled. And this, really helped people that were born with poor eyesight. Galileo invented the telescope, thermometer, made many other discoveries in physics, astronomy, and math. We'll talk about that. The musket was invented in Spain at the time. The flush toilet, thank goodness. And the ship rudder, which might seem innocuous, but was incredibly helpful for the age of exploration, which we'll talk about.
Ms. Crouch, let's jump back for a second and talk a little bit about guns, germs, and steel. How does the musket show this collaboration of knowledge where Europeans were perfecting a lot of these things rather than just inventing it on their own?
Tell us about it.
Well, if you remember back from Guns, Germs, and Steel, they talked about where gunpowder was invented. Where was gunpowder invented?
China.
Okay, and then obviously then they started using gunpowder to fire projectiles. Do you know who were the first to kind of pioneer some of that?
I don't. Tell me.
It was from the Middle East. A lot of times it was siege engines from the Middle East. But then in Europe, they actually ended up taking this technology and perfecting it into the musket.
Excellent. Renaissance literature also, big things coming out during this time. We already talked about Gutenberg, who invented the printing press, which was a way to quickly print books with movable type in the 1450s Common Era. The Gutenberg Bible being, like I said, one of the most important of those. We'll talk about later. Other authors began, Gutenberg wrote the Gutenberg Bible in Latin, which was common. It was the upper class language at the time that was taught to the rich and the religious. However, at this time, it's worth mentioning authors began to write in their own vernacular, which means their own spoken language, not just Latin and French, the other kind of high-class language of the time.
Was the Bible allowed to be written in things other than Latin, Ms. Crowe?
No, that would have definitely ruffled the feathers of the Catholic Church.
Why?
Well, tell us.
We'll talk more about that. Hold on, break. All right, and we're back.
Yep, here we go.
All right, we are back.
I just got learned by Mr. Schoaf about something.
That is not true. But the one thing about writing the Bible in Latin is that at that time the church did not believe that people were able to interpret the Bible on their own. They actually thought that a priest had to interpret it for them. That's why you could only write it in Latin, since most people couldn't read Latin. So the only people that could actually read the Bible were the priests and the educated, and then their job was to explain it to the masses. But that would change.
And that's also, which is common for the time, just another way for them to control the people, right?
Very true.
So William Shakespeare, famous playwright, also wrote poetry, wrote in English at the time. Canterbury Tales is a famous book about a traveling group of troopsmen that's written by Geoffrey Chaucer. He wrote that in English as well. Don Quixote was written by Miguel Cervantes, which was the first book written in Spanish to be widely produced.
That was excellent pronunciation in Spanish, by the way, Ms. Crouch.
Gracias, Señor Schoaf.
De nada.
And The Prince, which we will read an excerpt of later, was written by Machiavelli in Italian. So just to go quickly through some of the scientific inventions, this isn't on your sheet, but it's worth mentioning, that Da Vinci, jack of all trades, not just a painter and inventor, also studied, like Schoaf said, cadavers and anatomy. So you can, and we're back. Before I was rudely interrupted by the program quitting, I was talking about Da Vinci and his anatomical drawings that really helped scientists and doctors move forward with innovations in medicine. You've got Copernicus as well, which was proposed the blasphemous idea that the sun was the center of the universe, not the earth. And he was a precursor to Galileo, who then repeated that idea and was heavily persecuted by the Catholic Church for thinking that. And then Purbach was a mathematician and astronomer at the time that came up with some very innovative ideas. School's out. Just kidding. Renaissance math, they also made big advancements. The calculator came out during 1642, and the golden ratio, which you'll learn about later. Music, let's not forget. Some very famous Renaissance musicians and arrangers. What's the word for someone who writes music?
Composer?
There we go. I'm sick. Give me a break. Okay, so in Thomas Tallis, Bird, Monteverdi, Gabrieli, Bach, I'm sure you've heard Bach and Beethoven and Vivaldi. Those were all Renaissance era composers. And we can play some for you now while we continue to talk. Maybe not. Just to put you in the mood, you know what I'm saying? Go ahead. I wouldn't pick it up.
This is actually yours, but I'll do it.
Beautiful, isn't it? You've also got
Who is this, Miss Crouch?
well, I just changed it, but this is a very popular piece by Beethoven called Fiordalice. And we'll just listen to a few seconds.
All right, let's get back to the production.
All right, fine. Let me pause it. Okay, back to the notes.
So one of the last things in Renaissance, that rulers became more powerful. And the idea of these nation states started to sprout up. A lot of powerful kings and queens and powerful families, they united lands under a common language and culture. The examples that we gave for you here, King Henry VII and Elizabeth I united England. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella united Spain. And France achieved independence from England in 1450. So let's talk about the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is a time when the people wanted to reform the Catholic Church. That's all right, Miss. We need to go back a slide. Need to go. There we go. And we're back. So people were sick of the corruption within the church. One of the main things they were annoyed with was indulgences. Indulgences are basically, you can think of them as get out of hell free cards. That if you sinned, instead of actually having, instead of being judged by that, you could actually buy your way out of these sins by buying indulgences, which were documents that washed away sins. Obviously, this benefited the wealthy and not necessarily the poor. And people, a lot of people who were Catholics did not like this practice. Now, Protestants were originally people who just protested, you can see the root word there, against the Catholic corruption and teachings. Now, they did not set out to start a new church. All right, they set out to reform the Catholic Church. However, this division between these beliefs would eventually become the Protestant Reformation, and historians today would refer to it as the movement to reform or change the Catholic Church. The split between Catholic and Protestant churches led to many years of religious wars, which we will go in detail in when we are studying the printing press, because the spread of ideas about Catholicism and Protestantism is one of the things that sparked this religious war. So the first guy that you need to know is Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a German monk. He was excommunicated, which means he was kicked out of the Catholic Church. Now, a couple things he did. One, he threw up a big document on the door of a church, which basically was saying these are all the problems with the Catholic Church. One of these problems was indulgences. Other things that he did to gain the ire of the Catholic Church was that he translated the Latin Bible into German, which was a no-no. He also organized his own church, and he began to teach in German. He began to preach in German, which again was not something that the Catholic Church liked. Now, he would have been killed probably if he'd ventured to Italy, but he was protected by powerful German monarchs that were there at the time, that they had their own kind of their own agenda in wanting to fight against the Holy Roman Empire and the power of the Catholic Church as well. Another Protestant leader that you need to know is John Calvin. John Calvin was just another person who believed that the Catholic Church needed to be reformed. His followers would be called Huguenots in France. They would be called Puritans in England. Now, you may have heard the term Puritans because they eventually settled in America, came over on the Mayflower to escape religious persecution. Now this shows you a good map here. These are just European religions around 1555. If we jumped back 100 years, this map would basically all be Catholic. But only less than 100 years later, we now have many different Protestant religions such as Lutheran, which were followers of Martin Luther, Calvinist up here in Scotland, the Church of England, which was created by an English monarch, not really for religious reasons, but we'll go into that later. And also the green you still see is Roman Catholic.
And worth mentioning at this time that Muslim states still ruled North Africa. Greek Orthodox Church was present in the Byzantium Empire. Before it was taken over by Muslims, which ruled the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, the Byzantine Empire was conquered finally in 1453 by the Ottomans. So this is about 100 years after that. But one of the things we talked about before was how the Byzantine Empire used to encompass all of this area that's in the Ottoman Empire. But gradually, by the time that it was conquered in 1453, it was only Constantinople. They had no lands the empire had no lands other than that city.
So now we have our three sects of Christianity: the Orthodox, Catholicism, and Protestantism. So now we're going to talk about the Age of Exploration, which is on the back of your notes. It began around the mid-1400s. This was due to European powers increasing at the time. A lot of the innovations that happened during the Renaissance and before with ship technology helped a lot, like, for example, the rudder. And
Ms. Crouch, when you say there's looking for quicker trade routes, how come they didn't want to go over land?
Well, imagine how long that would take compared to the ease of sailing the seas.
Let's drop back to that map for 1 second that you just showed us. Who controlled these overland routes now after the fall of Constantinople?
Well, it seems like they'd be controlled by the Ottoman Empire.
Now, were the Ottoman Empire, do you think they were friendly with western part of Europe?
I seriously doubt it.
You are exactly right.
So it wasn't just about ease of travel, it was also that they'd be going through basically enemy territory.
Needed to find a new way.
Yep. And transferring tons and tons of goods over land, of course, would be quite a bit harder. And as we know, the geography of Asia is not simple to get around.
And robbers.
Right. So danger, speed, etc. These are all explorers that are well known today for finding quicker trade routes with Asia. Bartolomeu Dias was a Portuguese explorer who reached the southern tip of Africa in 1488. Vasco da Gama was also Portuguese. He sailed around Africa to India in 1498. So you can see how quickly it's progressing here. And Christopher Columbus, we all know, the Italian explorer that quote-unquote discovered the Americas for Spain. The Dutch, English, and French soon joined this exploration race. It became much like the arms race. It literally was an exploration race. And eventually, these connections between the Old World, which is Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the New World, which is South and North America, led to this huge cultural exchange called the Columbian or Great Exchange. And really, it was goods, people, disease, all being traded, and ideas back and forth. So let's take a look at this map. This shows the actual routes of explorers. And you can see like we talked about, Diaz and da Gama in green. Spain is in red. France, which joined later, in purple. And England in orange. And you can take a look at that at your leisure.
Pause now to look at the different trade routes.
These are the trade routes after or during the Age of Exploration, but after they had been explored. And you can see which countries had basically established stronger trade routes with which parts of the New World.
Pause now and take note of the different countries and where they have colonized and settled.
We're going to start talking about revolution in the third installment of the Modern Times Notes.
And we're back, and we are now going to talk about revolution. Now, you've heard about the Renaissance, which obviously was a new change of ideas. You've heard about the Protestant Reformation, which was, again, this exchange and changing of beliefs. And you've heard about the Age of Exploration, where people were traveling out to, now specifically for money, but also were exposed to a lot of new things. Now, a lot of these new ideas, eventually, a lot of people would want to put into place and start to question their leaders at home. Now, a revolution is simply a change in political organization, often through violent means. means. With the printing press, as Ms. Crouch talked to you about before, Europeans learned about democracies of ancient Greece and Rome, where people had a role in their government, and they craved more of a role in their governments. They started to believe no longer that it was just that the people were there to prop up the government, it was that the government had actually a responsibility to the people. They began to no longer believed is a little strong, but they began, rather than no longer believe, they began to, and I think we have this in your notes, that they began to question the divine right of kings, or the rule of will of God. Two famous writers who were writing about government duties and serving and protecting the people's freedoms were John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So, British democracy. Kings shared power with the Parliament, and the Parliament, originally was almost even kind of an advisor group to the king. Sometimes the king demolished it, sometimes it allowed it to have more power, but eventually the king would be overthrown. They would be forced to accept a constitution. Sometimes the Parliament itself would be the ones who are actually running the country. Now, of course, what we have today is not this absolute monarchy. We have the monarchy still exists in Great Britain, but it doesn't really have any power other than to wave and to look rich. And moving on to the American democracy, American colonies revolted against the Great Britain in the 1770s, and we are not really going to go into too much depth about that because your 8th grade social studies teachers would get mad at us. So we're just going to talk about the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the fact that they formed a Congress. This was a group of elected people that make decisions. The American Revolution became a model for others around the world, French, New Spain, etc. And Ms. Crouch has something that she needs to add here.
If you recall, a lot of the ideas of the American democracy and the Founding Fathers were formed by what ancient civilization, Mr. Shove?
I can't remember ancient civilizations because we did it, like a few days ago. Why don't you enlighten us, Ms. Crouch?
Well, it was a city-state in Greece. Is that helping?
Sparta.
No.
Okay.
Try again. What is it, guys?
Rome.
No. It's certainly Athens. Good job, Mr. Show.
Thank you. I'm getting smarter. Let's go to that last slide. So the last one we want to talk a little bit about is the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution was, again, modeled a little bit on the American Revolution. Actually, some of the big writers, Lafayette, who were writing some of the things that would shape the future of the French Revolution, were actually working closely with Thomas Jefferson, who had wrote the Declaration of Independence. King Louis XIV and Queen Marie Antoinette, they opposed this new French constitution that was created that limited their powers, so eventually they were executed, not necessarily at the beginning of the revolution, but during. After they were executed and kind of this republic took over, we have what we usually refer to as the Reign of Terror. And this isn't in your notes, but if you've ever heard of the guillotine, and you've ever heard of executions, this is the time of that, when basically over 40,000 people were killed in France for supporting the empire and supporting the monarchy and not supporting the republic. And many times they were dragged into jail, they were held there, and then they would have executions by the guillotine, which is a huge blade that falls from a big wooden frame to then chop your head off. It's fairly morbid. Interesting note, Ms. Crouch, is that a lot of times rich people would pay to be executed at the beginning of the day. Now, why would they want to be executed in the morning?
Well, I assume the guillotine would be a bit sharper, Mr. Shove.
Yes, morbid but true. That sometimes later in the day when the blade became dull, it might take a few drops in order to go all the way through your neck. Yikes.
I'm supposed to eat lunch.
So Napoleon Bonaparte, he eventually kind of arises from the ashes of this republic, and he becomes dictator. He creates the French Empire. They pretty much beat almost everyone militarily around Europe, and actually in North Africa as well. They go to Egypt and some other places. But other European powers eventually united and went to war against him, and ultimately Napoleon lost everything in around 1815. He gets exiled, he comes back for a little while, then eventually gets exiled again.
And this story inspired the very popular musical and movie Les Miserables.
Very true. Very true. This actually Les Miserables even takes place before the official Republican, or actually the official revolution. Yeah. And the last thing we want to tell you is that this revolution inspired even more revolutions around the world, specifically in Europe, in Greece, Belgium, Italy, and Germany. Now, Ms. Krause, can you think of anything else that we need to tell them about? Well, actually, let's review. We have a few minutes before this is going to shut us off. The first topic we talked about was the Renaissance. The second topic we talked about was the Protestant Reformation. And the third thing was the Age of Exploration, and the final was Revolution. Thank you, Miss Crouch.
Thank you, Mr. Show.